Я стою у главного храма Вооруженных сил России. На этом месте, на линии обороны Москвы, немецко-фашистские войска утратили ореол непобедимости. Территорию храма венчает музейный комплекс «Дорога памяти», протянувшийся на 1418 шагов по количеству дней от начала войны до победы. 1418 ступеней, по которым нацистская нечисть наконец была спущена в котел Нюрнбергского процесса. Все то, о чем говорилось на суде, мы видели своими глазами и испытали на себе. Новым же для нас было то, что сейчас нас вводили в самую кухню нацистского дьявола. Показывали, как кучка международных преступников и разбойников, опьяненная своими кровавыми успехами, хладнокровно планировала не только расчленение нашей Родины, не только ограбление ее народов, но и физическое их истребление. Так писал о том, что происходило в Нюрнберге, писатель и фронтовик Борис Полевой.
The most logical place for holding a trial of the Nazi war criminals would have been Berlin. This is what the Soviet Union insisted on. However, relations with the other allies had already grown fraught by this time, and they insisted on holding the trials in the American zone of occupation. The Soviet side acquiesced. The Americans had their reasons. In Berlin, there was no suitable courthouse that featured a jail. Moreover, this choice of venue had a symbolic importance. It was in Nuremberg, since 1927, that the Nazi Party had held its main gatherings. It was here that the Nuremberg racial laws were adopted. Among other things, these laws laid the foundation for marginalizing Jews and later expanded to cover Slavs and Roma. The unique feature of the Nuremberg trials lay in the fact that this was the first such case in global jurisprudence. Before then, international military tribunals were practically unheard of. The chief prosecutor on the Soviet side was Lieutenant General Roman Rudenko, then Prosecutor General for the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, and later Prosecutor General of the USSR.
Впервые в истории человечества правосудие сталкивается с преступлениями такого масштаба, вызвавшими такие тяжелые последствия. Впервые перед судом предстали преступники, завладевшие целым государством, и самое государство, сделавшее орудием своих чудовищных преступлений.
The Nuremberg trials were set up according to the standards of international law. On the Soviet side, they were overseen by Andrei Vyshinsky. Yes, the very same prosecutor who had been present at the Stalinist show trials in the 1930s. He was, however, a prominent legal mind, one recognized around the world. Today, it is occasionally claimed that Stalin was against the Nuremberg trials, that these trials were an American effort. Hogwash. It was the Soviet Union which, already on October 14, 1941, first proposed setting up an international trial for the Nazi criminals. In fact, the Americans, with their famous, albeit peculiar tradition of democracy, were initially against any publicity. The Americans and British were inclined to think that executing the Nazis without a trial was preferable to an open military tribunal. Otherwise, the Nazis might suddenly reveal something they weren't supposed to. Roosevelt and Churchill even wrote a letter to Stalin suggesting that war criminals be executed on the basis of an administrative decision by the Allies without any trial or further ado. But when Churchill visited Moscow in October 1945, Stalin won him over. In fact, Churchill was so convinced that he did not even bother handing Stalin the letter. Stalin's arguments were overwhelming. But in bombed-out Nuremberg, it was not easy to lodge the Allies' delegations. While the USSR and France were expected to send groups of 25 people, the USA announced that its representation would involve a whole 600 people who required comfortable conditions. Thus, the Americans' chief prosecutor, Robert Jackson, settled down in a huge mansion with a tennis court. He rode around in Hitler's armored limousine. Our delegation had considerably more modest demands. The International Military Tribunal, which had been set up as a partnership between the Soviet, US, British, and French governments, and then joined by another 19 countries, first convened on November 20th, 1945, to consider the cases of the major Nazi war criminals.
Это живые символы расовой ненависти, террора и насилия, преступности и жестокости власти. Они заставили страдать поколения в Европе, лишая Европу ее цвета, истребляя мужчин и превращая жизнь народов в трагедию.
Hermann Goering, the Nazis' number 2 man, commander of the Luftwaffe. Rudolf Hess, deputy leader of the Nazi Party since 1933, Reichsminister. Joachim von Ribbentrop, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Senior Official for the SS and Police, Director of the Reich Main Security Office. Alfred Rosenberg, the Reich Minister for the Occupied Eastern Territories. And also a dozen or so major Nazi figures. Each of the defendants had legal defense, and they were represented by a total of 27 attorneys, along with 54 paralegals and 67 secretaries.
Во имя священной памяти миллионов невинных жертв фашистского террора, во имя безопасности народов в будущем, мы предъявляем подсудимым полный и справедливый счет. Это счет всего человечества, счет воли и совести свободолюбивых народов. Пусть же свершится правосудие.
The Nuremberg Tribunal ran for 11 months, from November 20th, 1945 to October 29th, 1946. In less than a year, 403 open sessions of the tribunal were held, and 216 court hearings, which brought forth 240 witnesses. The charges fell under several groups. Aggression against Austria and Czechoslovakia. The invasion of Poland. The war of aggression against the whole world. Germany's invasion of the USSR in violation of the Non-Aggression Pact of August 23, 1939. Killings and inhumane treatment of civilians in the occupied territories. Deportation of the population of occupied territories into enslavement. Killings and inhumane treatment of prisoners of war. Devastation not justified by any military need. The list of crimes that were considered was huge, and the facts that came to light in Nuremberg continue to horrify and disgust us today. The culmination of the Nuremberg trials was the screening of a film on the Nazi crimes in the Majdanek Sachsenhausen, and Auschwitz concentration camps. As correspondent Ilya Ehrenberg recalled, when the film about the camps was shown, Schacht turned away from the screen. He was not willing to watch. Others watched, and Frank wept and wiped at his eyes with a handkerchief as he saw on the screen what he had seen a million times in reality. Maybe he was crying for himself. He realized what awaited him.
Я предъявляю суду под номером СССР 197 показания непосредственного участника изготовления мыла из человеческого жира, препаратора анатомического института в Данциге Зигмунда Мазура. Жир собирали из человеческих трупов Боркнер и Райхард. Мыло варил я из трупов мужчин и женщин. Из двух известных мне варок, в которых я принимал непосредственное участие, вышло готовой продукции мыла более 25 килограмм. Причем для этих варок было собрано 70-80 килограммов человеческого жира, примерно в 40 трупов.
About 1,500,000 persons were exterminated in Majdanek and about 4 million in Auschwitz. Another sensation was the testimony of Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus on Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union. Paulus had taken part in the drafting of these plans. Proof of plans for Operation Barbarossa, the deliberate, treacherous attack on the USSR, was the most important piece of evidence.
По показаниям подсудимого Кейтеля, Гитлер собирался напасть на СССР в конце 1940 года. Это подтверждается и показаниями подсудимого Иодля, который на допросе показал, что планы нападения на СССР конкретно были разработаны в ноябре-декабре 1940 года. И в тот период времени им были даны первые директивы армии, морскому флоту и военно-воздушному флоту.
From the indictment of the Nuremberg trials. From the first day of launching their attack on Soviet territory, the Nazi conspirators, in accordance with their detailed plans, began to carry out the destruction of cities, towns, and villages, the demolition of factories and collective farms, the robbery and barbaric devastation of the natural cultural institutions of the peoples of the USSR, the devastation of museums, schools, hospitals, churches, and historical monuments, the mass deportation of the Soviet citizens for slave labor to Germany, as well as the annihilation of adults, old people, women, and children, especially Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, and the extermination of the Jews.
Перед вами пройдут десятки тысяч свидетелей. Они вызваны в зал суда по этому делу. Я не смогу назвать их имен, и вы не приведете их к присяге. Но их показаниям нельзя не верить, ибо мертвые никогда не лгут.
Город Ростов. Эти кадры засняты операторами Сологубовым, Поповым и Левитаном 29 ноября 1941 года. Вот замученная семья профессора Рождественского. На Ростовском вокзале немцами были подвергнуты уничтожению раненые военнопленные красноармейцы. На трупах военнопленных следы пыток. У многих изуродованы лица. целях сокрытия своих актов истребления военнопленных немцы подвергали трупы сожжению. На улицах, внутри сараев и разрушенных жилищ обнаружены трупы сожженных красноармейцев. Многие семьи жителей были выгнаны из домов и убиты. На этом пустыре, отдаленном от города, было истреблено 7000 граждан Керчи. Предместье города Нальчик. В этом противотанковом рву обнаружено более 600 трупов замученных и расстрелянных мирных жителей Нальчика и близлежащих районов.
Beginning with June 1943, the Germans carried out measures to hide the evidence of their crimes. They exhumed and burned corpses. They crushed the bones with machines and used them for fertilizer. Returning to their native haunts, the soldiers of the Army of Liberation saw the many villages, towns, and cities which had been reduced to so much wasteland. On the territory of the Soviet Union, the Nazis destroyed 1,710 cities and more than 70,000 villages and hamlets, more than 6 million buildings, and made homeless about 25 million people. The Germans destroyed 427 museums, among them the museums of Leningrad, Smolensk, Stalingrad, Novgorod, and Poltava. The Germans approached monuments of culture dear to the Soviet people with special hatred. They broke up the estate of poet Pushkin in Mikhailovskaya, desecrating his grave, burned the neighboring villages, and blew up the Svetogor monastery. The Nazis robbed the estate and museum of Leo Tolstoy, Yasnaya Polyana, and desecrated the grave of the great writer.
Рядом с могилой Льва Толстого они осмелились закопать вшивые трупы своих мародеров и висельников.
In Klin, they destroyed the Museum of Tchaikovsky, and in Penati, the Museum of the painter Repin, and many others. The Nazis desecrated and senselessly destroyed also the most valuable monuments of the Christian Church, such as Kievo-Pecherskaya Lavra, Novy Jerusalem Monastery in the Eastern region, and other ancient monasteries and churches. All these monstrous crimes had a definite system of their own. There was uniformity in the murder methods. One and the same system prevailed in the construction of the gas chambers. The ovens of the crematories were built on the same typical lines, and one plan extended over all the camps of destruction. All this indicates one sole and evil will, uniting all the individual assassins and executioners. It was also evident that the death factories brought into existence an entire series of auxiliary industries.
Это очки убитых. Горшочки детей, убитых вместе с родителями. Перед казнью женщин стригли. Волосы педантично взвешивались, упаковывались, отправлялись в Германию, перерабатывались в канаты для кораблей, шли на матрацы.
The atmosphere in the courtroom occasionally overheated with suspense.
Выступая на этом суде от имени народов Союза Советских Социалистических Республик, я считаю полностью доказанным все обвинения, предъявленные подсудимым. Во имя памяти миллионов невинных людей, загубленных бандой преступников, во имя счастья и мирного труда будущих поколений, я призываю суд вынести всем без исключения подсудимым высшую меру наказания – смертную казнь.
The sentence of the International Military Tribunal stated, "This indictment charges the defendants with crimes against peace by the planning, preparation, initiation, and waging of wars of aggression, with war crimes and with crimes against humanity. The defendants are also charged with participating in the formulation or execution of a common plan or conspiracy to commit all these crimes. 12 Nazi criminals, Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, Kaltenbrunner, Jodl, Frank, Frick, Saukel, Streicher, Seyss-Inquart, and in absentia Bormann, were sentenced to death by hanging." There was an interval of about 2 weeks between the passing of the sentences and the executions. The executions were scheduled for October 16th. 3 hours before his execution, Hermann Goering managed to commit suicide by means of a cyanide capsule. Where did he get that from? The condemned men were executed by 2 American servicemen, Sergeant John Woods, a professional hangman since 1920, and military policeman Joseph Malta, who volunteered to help him. Russian people did not take part in these executions. It was enough that we had defeated fascism. Not alone, but we had broken its back. The book was closed on these men at the Dachau concentration camp, where the coffins with their bodies were brought. They were all cremated in the furnaces of the concentration camp, and the ashes were scattered in a nearby river so that they would not become an object of veneration for later Nazis. But whether the Nuremberg trials were indeed the final act of World War II continues to be an open question for some.